morning, guys. Hello to our sixth lecture in a course of translation. And as we start today's lesson, we're going to know the different types of translation. So to finish talking about the course's translation, there's several types of translation or kinds of translation. And we start off with types according to agent. What is it? What does that? We start before we move into that. We get a brief introduction about the types of translation. Typologies of translation have been, suggested by different writers at different times and according to different theoretical and methodological criteria. In this text, or types of translation are classified in our lesson today into four main kinds or ways. We're going to talk about the agent performing the translation. That's the types according to agent. And the language medium, later in the second slide. The subject matter and the method of translation. We get to know all these into very much details. So now we start with the types according to agent. What is it and what does it include? So according to the agent performing the translation task, we speak of a human translation. That's a human translation. And machine translation, abbreviated as MT. Let's get to know what's a human translation. As we do translation, we're a human, so that's the type of human translation is. A human translation is defined as the translation produced by a human rather than a machine translator. This is the oldest type of translation purely, of course, based on a translator's linguistic rendering competence. Despite the high advances in using technology in translation, translations produced by human remain higher in the degree of quality. It's more quality than any other types of translation, of course, than translation produced by machines. So if we look into, if we're comparing between a human translation task and a machine translation task, we realize that the human performing way much better than the machines do. So if you look at the translation, for instance, of a human, any person, any translator, and look compared to translations done by a Google translation, for instance, you would realize that human is way much better, And on the other side, that's machine translation. What is it? Is the translation performed automatically by a computer using a huge databases with different degrees of human intervention. Some MT systems are purely automatic, but other systems do require some kind of human intervention. Yes, of course. Sometimes they don't work by itself. They need a human to monitor these types of machines. Human intervention in MT is sometimes required before transfer the source, the ST, which is called the pre-editing, Sometimes a human intervention is needed after the translation to edit the output. Of course, we do it sometimes. We take a translation from Google or any other computer software, and as a human, we look into it and we edit what's necessary, sometimes a human intervention is needed after the translation to edit the output, which is called, and we call it post-editing. If you want to read more, look into Blumpo 2009, page 73. As a technology, MT, machine translation, has been making big advances since the 50s, when MT research started. Now it makes use of advances in computational linguistics, computer science, artificial intelligence, اللي هو الذكاء الاصطناعي, and voice recognition technology. However, despite advances and improvements in machine translation, it remains a tool with some limitations. Of course, it has limitations. It can't be in place of a human translation. However, it does well, especially in dealing with non-standardized language like the languages of literary and religious texts. For more on machine translation, see Bing. If you're more interested to look into machine translation, you may consult these scholars, Somers 2011 and Hutchins 2011 as well, and many more. So that's the whole on the type according to agent and human translation versus machine translation. Into our second slide, finishing talking about the types of translation, and that's the second types according to language medium. What does that mean? The term medium is used here in linguistic sense of means by which a message is conveyed. That's Richard and Schmidt, 1985. The two basic media are speech and writing, of course. Media of instruction, speech and writing. So according to language medium, translations are either oral or written translation. Terminologically in English, the term interpreting, that's as you see it in the slide, interpreting, is referred to oral translation, of course, while the term translation refers to any written translation, we call it a translation. Interpreting is an ancient human practice which clearly predates the invention of writing and written translation. This is because the human communities have relied on the communication on speech before the development of writing systems. In its origins, interpreting took place when members of different linguistic and cultural communities into contact for some particular purpose. So let's look into the written translation. What is it? What's a written translation? Is the translation of written text, such as translation of documents, reports, film scripts, books, and different subjects. So as you students of English, sometimes some of your relatives or parents, colleagues would ask you to translate something for them, a piece of paper. So all these types of translation is called written translation. Law, business, politics, science, literature, Jabber 2005. Unlike oral translation, that's what we call is interpreting. So interpreting is the oral translation of one language to another. Written translation doesn't have to be performed at the same place where the source, where the essay writer is available, but sometimes after the writing of a source text, or at least part of it. In this way, the translator is more fortunate to have some time to familiarize herself with the source text, and to use helpful references such as encyclopedia, dictionaries, glossaries, and internet research engines and websites. So it's different from the spontaneous. So that's the interpreting. So written translation, you have time where you can consult other sources for it. Throughout history, translators belonging to different societies and civilization have translated large quantities of materials of different types from other languages to their own languages and vice versa. On word translation traditions, see Baker and Saladna 2009. So that's the one type according to the medium, language medium, whether it's written or oral. And now we finish talking about the other type, and that's according to subject matter. Written text and language don't belong to the same domain, of course. Different domains deal with different subjects, issues, and problems using different text formats, different writing conventions and styles, and different terminologies. These types of variation reflect the intrinsic diversity, okay? The intrinsic diversity. It's 11 o'clock. In the nature of domains, texts are also written by different authors in different contexts for different purposes using different writing strategies based on variation in form, structure, style, and terminology, and content, subject matter. Texts are classified traditionally into general, dealing with general matters, so the way it's written, and specialized text dealing with very specialized matters as politics, law, medicine, etc. Specialized texts are also classified into subtypes such as literary text اللي هي النصوص الأدبية، النصوص العلمية scientific text, medical text, business text, print media text, audio visual text, advertising text, and legal text. In translating these types of text, translators encounter different challenges and problems and use different translation strategies and techniques. So translators also use different types of reference materials and dictionaries and spend different amounts of time based on these differences. Translations are classified according to their source text types into different types of writing or written translation, such as general translation, literary translation, scientific translation, medical translation, تجارية, ترجمة تجارية, print media translation, audiovisual translation, advertising translation, and legal translation. For more issues related to different types of translation, so you see, we have different types of translation according to the subject matter. So the subject matter هو الموضوع، يعني موضوع الترجمة قد ينقسم إلى عدة أنواع. المقصود بموضوع اللي يحتاج إلى ترجمة مثلا في النصوص الأدبية، العلمية، الطبية، سمي ما شئت. So that what has to do with the subject matter. And now we very quickly touch on types according to method. What is it? As indicated, text vary in terms of their contents, purposes, structure, writing strategies, style, الأسلوبية والغرض والمحتوى. Translators and or translation commissioners translate text for explicit or implicit purposes and for actual or potential readers' uses in actual or potential context. This entails the use of different translation strategies. We use, of course, different strategies. We consult sources, consult friends, sometimes very specialized friends. It's translation for a certain text. These strategies are macro translation approaches dealing with text as whole, such as literal translation, free translation الحرة، الترجمة الحرة والحرفية خدناها كانت تذكروا في المحاضرة الأولى. Domestication, adaptation, تكييف يعني, and localization. The resulting translation are labeled with the strategies used in producing them. Example are in statements like, this is a literal translation of The Old Man and the Sea. I like the free translation of Shakespeare's sonnet. I have just watched the adaptation of Arthur Miller's play in Arabic. Have you seen a new localized translation of McDonald's advertisement? The speaker strategy-based types such as literal translation, اللي هي الحرفية كلمة بكلمة. free translation الحرة. semantic translation, communicative translation, covered translation, and overt. So you see the different types of methods that we reach our goal to translate certain text. Okay, and that's the whole types of discussion we've mentioned to talk about in our first lesson. So our next slide, we're going to talk mainly about interpreting and what is it, what's interpreting. Yeah, what's interpreting? What's the term interpreting? It is used to mean oral translation of spoken messages. However, one scholar makes a valid observation that interpreting need not necessarily be equated with oral translation, or more precisely with the oral rendering of spoken messages. Doing so would exclude interpreting in signed languages. Based on one scholar's view, focuses on an aspect of immediacy اللي طول يعني, and suggests the following definition. Interpreting, let's hear it, is a form of translation which a first and final rendition نقل يعني, in another language is produced on a basis of one-time presentation of an utterance in a source language. So the person performing this activity is called interpreter, who is fluently bilingual, يمتلك متحدث لغتين, individual with appropriate training and experience, and is able to interpret with consistency and accuracy, like the translator, in order to be acknowledged as professional. The interpreter has to adhere to the standards of practice and ethical principles, مبادئ الأخلاقية والمهنية أكيد. Interpreting differs from translation in a number of aspects. First, the communication skills required by interpreting are very different, as interpreters need to be expert oral communicators. Second, translators usually have relatively enough time to revise and improve their translation before submitting them, but interpreters are required to create a finished product in real time without having the possibility of going back to make a revision. Third, interpreters have to make sure that they have the necessary knowledge in advance, as they don't have the privilege of consulting references or colleagues because they're on a spot. لأن الترجمة الفورية interpreting يعني ما عندكش مجال، ما عندكش وقت أنك أنت تخضع إلى أو تستشير زملاء أو مصادر أخرى، بينما الترجمة العادية هذه عندك وقت ومجال تستعين فيه يعني بزملائك بكذا. Fourth, interpreting experience higher stress levels while interpreting than most translators. This is because interpreters are performers making real-time second decisions and taking communicative risks. In modern times, the most striking feature of this activity is no longer its mystery, but its diversity. Interpreting is performed in every possible domain and setting, from hospital, law courts, television shows in the Oval Office, U.S. President's office in the White House, from university lectures to business negotiation and church service, guided tours of science spots, prisoner interrogations, meetings of NGOs, corporate boards, and the UN Security Council, based on the nature of a source, message, and type of context or setting. Interpreting falls into 6 main types as follows. Now we're looking into the different types of interpreting, and one type we start with that's conference interpreting, ترجمة المؤتمرات أو الترجمة الفورية أثناء المؤتمرات. Okay, so what is conference interpreting? Conference interpreting is used in national and international conferences as well as other high-level gatherings and meetings. Conference interpreting consists of two main kinds. One is simultaneous interpreting, and that is the immediate technology-assisted rendering of speech. The interpreter sits in a special booth. عندهم أدوات خاصة يعني حجرة صغيرة هيك booth يسموا فيها. Listens to the speaker through headphones and at the same time translates the speaker's speech into a microphone. The microphone carries the interpreting to the audience through headsets. This takes place mostly in conferences, gatherings, and big meetings. You might have seen it on TVs, how it happens, or you look for it on the YouTube channels. Okay? The second type is consecutive, as you see it in the slide, interpreting اللي هي التتبعية. الأولى simultaneous يعني الفورية. أما الثانية التتبعية consecutive interpreting, which is the interpreting of speech part by part. يعني يتكلم المتكلم ومن ثم يقف pauses بعد يترجم المترجم وهكذا. That's why we call it تتبعية. Consecutive. The interpreter sits on or stands next to the speaker. The speaker speaks for some time and then stops. The interpreter translates that part of speech and stops again. And the interpreter interprets and stops, and so on. That's how it goes. Usually, the interpreter takes notes to help remember the speaker's ideas. This takes place in situations where simultaneous interpreting is not possible or not needed. So that's how conference interpreting goes. And it, as we said, we have simultaneous and consecutive. Now we move into whispered interpreting اللي هي الترجمة بالهمس. في جنبك يبدأ جالس المترجم. Also referred to by the French term widespread interpreting, is a type of simultaneous interpreting without using an interpreting booth. يعني يبدأ واقف في جنبك وبدون ما تستخدم هذا اللي كنا نحكوا عليه زي الصندوق. It's used in business setting, conference and trials to provide immediate interpreting for one or two participants by an interpreter seated next to them, speaking in a low voice in order not to disturb other participants. So you see how it goes, whispered, because it's called whispered همس يعني همس ترجمة الهمس. Sight translation or interpreting. This is the oral translation of written text, usually a document in sight translation. The translator reads and understands the written text or a chunk of it in a source language and says its meaning in a target language. Sight translation نظرية يعني أو تشوفها بشيء بنظر بخلسة is used in healthcare, legal and business settings when written translation is not needed or no time to do it. So that's according to Jabir 2005. Now the next type of interpreting is community. This is a type of interpreting that takes place in a course of communication among speakers of different languages in the context of providing public services such as healthcare, community services, and in settings such as government agencies, community centers, legal settings, educational institutions, social services. Community interpreting is mostly conducted in a consecutive mood, the one we just talked about. Other terms have been used to describe community interpreting, such as public service interpreting, cultural interpreting, dialogue interpreting, حوارية يعني ترجمة الحوارات والثقافات, institutional interpreting, Latin interpreting, and hoc interpreting, Hale 2007. Now we're moving into our last type of interpreting we're mentioning this lecture is the remote interpreting. And what is it? This is interpreting involving electroacoustic and audiovisual transmission نقل يعني system to reach for beyond the given location. remote اللي هو بعيد يعني الأماكن البعيدة. Remote interpreter is used when the interpreter is not available in the same room as the speaker or listener or both. Telephone interpreting is the oldest form of remote interpreting. Of particular significance is the development of video phone interpreting for the deaf and hard of hearing. Okay, so that's a remote interpret, and this happens a lot. Sometimes the interpreter is not on the spot, is not physically attended, so they just consult them to interpret from a far away location. So that's our main lecture, different types of translation and the different types of interpreting. Thank you for listening. Get well, hear this out well, take notes and be ready for your exam. See you next, or talk to you next lecture.